So, to everyone who's watching this, I want to say, I hope you had a good Christmas. Tell you a happy New Year. We will continue with the more traditional readings this week in our sacred gatherings. We're moving away from Isaiah, which was kind of preparatory for Christmas, and the readings this week seem to focus to me on kind of the humanity. They all seem to have kind of anthropology as their study and as their focus. Of course, in during Christmas time, that it's a little different focus because this is the group of people that God has chosen to join in Jesus' life. So we're going to look at Psalm 8, which at first does not seem to be about people, and rightly it focuses on God in its entirety and God's greatness. But it does do a lot of kind of defining on kind of who humanity is and what our relationship is to the world. So, like any good poem or song, it exists in kind of a context. There are certain things that this song is going to make reference to that we may not necessarily, as Western readers, all these years later, centuries and centuries, several thousand years later, aren't going to necessarily jump out to us, but they're really important for, I think, understanding what this psalm is trying to say. The first of these pieces we have to understand is kind of the worldview that was assumed by a lot of people in the biblical audience, although it is one that the Bible doesn't necessarily agree with, and that was their understanding that when the world was created, it was a battle between the powers of order and chaos. So, in many, many different ancient Near Eastern kind of mythology stories, there is some kind of a goddess, usually, or a god that is a monster of some kind that represents chaos. They're usually associated with the sea as well. And there's often some kind of a warrior god or goddess that is going to fight with this monster. And they are going to represent the power, order in the world. And when they defeat chaos, um, they get to order the world, and that's kind of the creation story. And so we have a ton of different variations on this. And the Bible recognizes this, that this was kind of how the peoples around them describe the world. And so it plays with these ideas. That's actually, largely what the book of Genesis is arguing, in fact, that there are not multiple gods squabbling over these things, gods of chaos and gods of order, but in fact, both of those things, what seems chaotic, actually has its place in the universe, that it is actually part of the world that God has created. And God is not, of course, fighting to create the entire world. He simply speaks. He imagines the world and it creates into being. It's a very different view um, on what God's power and God's way of creating things is, and it stands. Their gods stand out very differently from the other gods that were at the time. Kind of the other metaphor that is going to be used in this psalm we're going to hear is that of the idea of this ancient Near Eastern vassal or a governor. And these are ideas that we just don't really have any kind of an analog here in America. And when we're in a democracy, we're a long ways away from monarchies, and even the Eastern European monarchies that we're familiar with from history just had a very different understanding of what their subordinates were doing in the ancient Near East that are being referred to in this psalm than than these ancient than like medieval Europe, for instance, has with its kings. So a vassal or a governor in the ancient Near Eastern was considered almost a direct representative, not like just someone who talks for them, not the way we think of representatives in our local government who may or may not represent us very well, right? The goal of this vassal, this governor, this person who is acting on the authority is to represent and think like them as closely as possible. They, just like we're used to the idea of bureaucracy having all kinds of different layers of capability, and they often have their own agendas, their own way of doing things, their own little kingdoms carved out in a bureaucracy. And this idea is, is probably practically, there was probably a lot of that back in the day, but the ideal, the kind of cultural way of thinking about this was this governor, this vassal who's acting on behalf of the great king, the great emperor, or whatever. Their goal is to think like them. Their goal is to represent like them. Their goal is to, as they're making decisions, say, okay, well, what would, this king do in this situation? And that's what they would answer for. When they came and they had to show responsibility for the choices for the way they've been governing, the question came down to a lot of the time, were you doing it the way I would have done it? Do you value the things I value? Do you think the way I think, right? And so to be a governor or vassal isn't just to be capable. It's also, you gotta know your sovereign. You gotta know who the person is, what they value, the way they think, because you are attempting to represent them. You're attempting to do things kind of by proxy, just like they would have done them if they had actually been here. And so that image is also going to sneak into this psalm. So sorry, a lot of background, but you need to kind of hear both of those, both the disputed language about chaos versus order in the created world, which again, this psalm's going to change a little bit from the way they used to understand it, but also just this kind of very close representational understanding of what someone, the vassal or the governor, is doing on behalf of another ruler. So listen for both of those as I read this psalm. I'm looking at this psalm. It's a little more sing-song than many of the modern translations. This is just a very beautiful kind of lyric translation I'm getting from the Brady and Tate version of the Psalms, which was published in 1696. So yeah, you can imagine it's going to sound a little old-fashioned. O thou to whom all creatures bow, within this earthly frame, through all the world how great art thou, how glorious is thy name. In heaven thy wondrous acts are sung, nor fully reckoned there, and yet thou makest the infant tongue thy boundless praise declare. Through thee the weak confound the strong, and crush their haughty foes, and so thou quellest the wicked throng that thee and thine oppose. When heaven thy beauteous work on high employs my wondering flight, the moon that nightly rules the sky with stars of feebler light, what's man, say I, that Lord thou lovest to keep him in thy mind, or what his offspring, that thou provest to them so wondrously kind? Him next in power thou didst create by thy celestial train, ordained with dignity and state o'er all thy works to reign. They jointly own his powerful sway, the beasts that prey or graze, the bird that wings its airy way, the fish that cuts the seas. O thou to whom all creatures bow within this earthly frame, through all the world how great art thou, how glorious is thy name. So the first section here, I think, is the one that's playing on what I was just talking about, right? The fact that God's control, God's ordering of the way the world is disputed, but wherein the kind of ancient mythology, this was disputed by some kind of a monster representing chaos, they kind of make a little twist on that in this psalm and say, yes, it is disputed, but it's disputed by injustice, the fact that things are not right, things are not the way they meant to be. And in the biblical mind, that's not just chaos, that's not just the kind of natural powers at play in the world. That has to do with human choice most of the time. Things are not the way they're supposed to be. And so we do get these, we start out with just the talking about God's wonder and God's glory, the way God has made things, but we pretty quickly come into this image of, the way God would have things be is disputed by human history. We hear first this reference to the, thou makest the infant tongue thy boundless praise declare. And it's interesting because I think we can think of kind of Jesus' teachings on this one, right? That, praise can come from even small children in their simplicity and the innocence. Those are associations we have with childhood. In the Old Testament, children are most often mentioned when they're suffering. They, are considered the weakest of the weak, those who cannot defend themselves in a hard and often ugly world. And so children's speaking or children crying out almost always is linked with injustice. When things are wrong, things have gotten so bad that even the children are needing to cry out, even the children are needing to defend themselves. And so we hear that language continuing. Through thee the weak confound the strong and crush their haughty foes, and so thou quellest the wicked throng that thee and thine oppose. And so the first thing that is brought up about God's greatness here is the fact that he takes the side of the weak. He takes the side of children who are so often history's victim. He takes those who cannot defend themselves, and he becomes their defender. He becomes their strength. And that, that which we mistake for power, that which we mistake because of its effectiveness in so much of human history, is not the way God does things. It is not what power is not what makes God great. It's how he uses that power. And he uses that power on behalf of the small and the weak and children and the innocent. He uses it to defend those who can't defend themselves. And so the very first thing it talks about, yes, God is a creator God, but there is an element of the created world, of human choice and human history, that is not as God would have it be. And God is not sitting back wringing his hands. He's defending the weak. He is active. He is there continuing to fight. Again, not against some kind of a chaos monster, but against human choice and the fact we often make the wrong choice and we harm one another and we harm ourselves. God is in the midst of this. And so the first praise of God that is done in here is God's inability to accept injustice, God's unwillingness to accept injustice, to defend those who are weak and strong. And then after that, it turns to kind of God's way of being in the world again, at looking at kind of the creation itself, as we said. When heaven, thy beauteous work on high, employs my wondering flight, the moon that nightly rules the sky, with stars of feebler light. So we start with this kind of big cosmic vision, right? Hopefully, most of us can still feel a sense of awe and wonder looking at the beauty and the immensity of the night sky. And just, I think that's just gotten better in recent years as we've learned more, as our telescopes have gotten better, as we are able to realize the sheer scale of the universe that we are in. It should bring us to a place of wonder, a place of awe. Are we supposed to, think about the physics of it and how that works stuff? Absolutely. I think that is very much a way to worship God. But the Bible almost always mentions creation because it is meant to show us how big it is. It is meant to show us that we are a small part of it, and it is meant to bring about attention to the Creator, the one who is more powerful on those things, as I said, who spoke these things into being. And so we get this interesting contrast between this huge, cosmic, wonderful universe and this other puny little thing that also seems to hold God's attention, right? What is man, or what is humanity in modern English? What is humanity, say I, that, Lord, thou lovest to keep us in thy mind? Or what are our offspring that thou provest to them so wondrously kind? Again, with all your cosmic power, why do you pay attention to little us, puny humanity who lives so short, who makes so many mistakes? And yet, there is an incredible dignity given to humanity in here because of God's attention. Him next in power thou didst create to thy celestial train, ordained with dignity and state over all thy works to reign. They jointly own his powerful sway, the beasts that prey or graze, the bird that wings its airy way, the fish that cuts the seas. And so this is again when that idea of the governor comes in, because we're of course referring to early chapters of Genesis in which humanity is given dominion over the rest of the created order. So this psalm is really important because it's pointing out first, if you're looking just pure scale, right, we're not that impressive. When you compare us to the moon, the stars, the vast cosmos, we are these puny little things. And yet God's attention and God's honoring us with the chance to be part of that creation, but also to be set up over it in some way. That's where this language of dominion comes in. And yet the kind of critique that has been made in recent years against kind of this language of dominion, and I think the just arrogant assumption that because we're in charge, right? Dominion means we're in charge. We can do whatever we want with the world, or the often sad assumption that, well, this whole thing's burning anyway. We're just heading to heaven. That you hear, which you hear sometimes in churches, which is just bad theology, by the way, that shows that really doesn't understand how deeply beloved the created order is to God, or how deeply embedded we are within it in the biblical worldview. It's really hard to square with what we've been reading here and what we've been reading in Genesis. Again, both of those passages have talked at length about how strong and how powerful God is, right? Before we get to puny humanity with its dominion over the other parts of the world. And it becomes really difficult to take this kind of modern view that the world is simply resources that we can take from and use from as we want, um, both in light of how much God was talked about, how beloved the world is to God, and in the Bible's kind of views of what kingship, of what dominion, of what strength actually look like. For one, those passages are always playing, as I talked earlier, on this idea of being a governor or a vassal to God, right? If the world is in fact God's and we are that type of vassal, we have to represent him. We have to think the way he thinks. We need to make decisions the way God does. And again, in the Bible, power and greatness and the great use of power always has to do with nurturing and caring for, first and foremost, the least, the weakest, and then bringing about kind of wholeness and greatness for everyone else. There's almost no examples of power well used by God, by Jesus, by any of the good kings in the Bible as someone who bullies people, as who tries to do things their own way, right? This is always critiqued. And so if we are going to take passages like this seriously and find ourselves way down at the bottom, right, in the midst of creation, with this incredible gift given to us, the dignity that God trusts us with things that are valuable to him, this created world and one another, I just think it changes the way we have to approach the way we approach other species, the way we approach other countries, the way we approach other people, and the way we approach God, right? In this passage, again and again, the created order is brought forth as beautiful and thorough and complete. And it should bring us, as we look at our place in the midst of that, to a place of wonder and awe, because God allows us to be part of that as well. God, as humanity, has given us an incredible calling. And so I think, yeah, like I said, this view that we can just take from the created world, that these are just resources to be used as we please, is hard to square. I think we also see kind of the extreme other view that, you hear the metaphor that humanity is just a plague upon, that we're bacteria and the world would be better off without us. That's a little hard to square with the Bible's view either. And I almost think of some of my friends who've been in forestry, that the teaching is, okay, if this is what is absolute best for the land, at times, yes, we do need to cut out dead things because, invasive species, invasive beetles and things can get in there. Maybe it gets overcrowded based on whatever the conditions are. And so there's a care and a nurture. It doesn't mean just completely leaving the natural world alone. We have a responsibility to make it thrive, to bring out the best. We have the right to take our food from the land and to eat the other animals according to the biblical view. But it always needs to be done not as this kind of resource-based thing. It needs to be done as this kind of caring and nurturing. We are part of the natural world. So I'm sorry if I'm going off on this a little bit too much. It's what I've been studying, but it's a real passion of mine too. I think the way we tend to view the world and the way we tend to take passages like this that talk about humanity in service of something else that we already view is frankly unbiblical, and it's disgusting. It does not jive with how God sees the world. It does not jive with God sees humanity, and I see that in passages like these. I think we need to approach things really differently. So sorry if I got on my high horse a little bit there, because again, the point of this passage is not about humanity. It's about God. And so we look at the beginning and say the world is not all as it should be. And again, that applies to some of the ecological stuff I've been talking about. Not all is right in the world. And yet God is active and God is doing something about it. praise God. That should lead us to a place of awe and wondering at God's glory. We look at the naturally created world with wonder and thoroughness and be amazed at what God has done, at both our place in it and our place taking care of it. That also should lead us to awe and wonder. We can even look at ourselves, humanity, fearfully, wonderfully made, with this awesome privilege of joining God in caring for the rest of the world and bringing about the wholeness that God always dreams of, that God is always talking about in the Bible, when all things fit, when all things are brought to their fruition, when there is no more conflict between the natural world and the human world and within each of those spheres, right? When all is made well, we look at ourselves, as puny as we are invited into this incredible story with this incredible responsibility. That too should lead us to a place of awe and wonder and worship. And so, what I love about this psalm is, again, its focus on God and how any of those spheres, any of those places should lead to awe and wonder. And so, my question to leave us with this week is, what in our lives are we closely paying attention enough to? Is it, is it the natural world? Is it the need of the world and the fact that we see God's people working and the fact that we believe God is working in the deep needs and the deep injustices of the world? Where are we seeing God at work? Is it within our own hearts, our own sense of peace and being taken care of? Where is God working? What are we seeing God doing? And is it inspiring in this a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, and a sense of worship?